Yes, and welcome to week 9. Last week we talked about selected response items, and today we're going to talk about constructed response items or questions. Here's the vocabulary you'll be responsible for from this chapter. Don't forget the optional vocabulary assignment. So, what are constructed response items? They're items or test questions in which students must supply the answer. Sometimes you might hear them called supply type. There are basically three types of constructed response items that you may use on your quiz assignment. The first is called completion items. It's objective because you're looking for specific objective words to go in, not just any old words. Sometimes you'll hear it, or frequently you'll hear this type of item called a fill in the blank. So if I were to give you an item, for example, that said the sky is blank, and I was looking for the word blue and you marked it orange, that would be wrong. A second type of constructed response item is a short answer, and this is anywhere between one word and a short paragraph. So in a sense, completion items are short answers, but generally when we refer to short answers, we're talking about a sentence or two or up to a paragraph. So for example, if I asked you to write a definition for the word civility, you might do that in a short answer. An essay is a little bit longer, and they're really good for assessing very complex questions. So you don't generally ask students to do an essay question on something simple like, what color is the sky? Because that's a short answer. But you want to ask them to do something, when you want to ask them to do something more complicated, requires more in-depth thinking and demonstration of understanding, you're likely to use an essay. Now, there are two types of essays. One is called a restricted response, and you might hear this called a short essay, and it's usually about a paragraph or two. And then there's a second essay called an extended response, which is a longer essay, and it's often a page or two or even more, depending on the age of the student. So restricted response, extended response, and these are actually the terms that most standardized tests use, state standardized tests use as well. So as we said, the completion items are good for measuring simple knowledge. They're easy to write and score. Um, they're less useful for measuring complex content or higher level thinking skills. So think about that item I said, the sky is blue. That doesn't really measure anything except for students' factual knowledge about the color of the sky. They provide less coverage of content. And I'm going to add another downfall. They are objective, but you can sometimes get yourself into situations where students give you an answer that's technically true, but you're looking for something else. So, for example, if a student wrote the sky is azul, well, azul is a type of blue. That wasn't the word you were looking for, but it is blue. Would you accept that as an answer or not? And that's kind of a silly example, but you get you take the meaning of what I'm trying to say, which is that there are alternative answers and you have to decide whether to give credit for them. Examples of good completion items. The most common gas in the Earth's atmosphere is blank. A person who draws the pictures for a book is called an blank. Notice that in a good completion item, the item is worded such that the blank comes at the end of the sentence. So some guidelines for developing good fill in the blank or completion items. Do not use verbatim sentences from textbooks. Paraphrase instead. Students may remember the exact wording of things in the textbook without really understanding what the concept is. Word the sentence that only a single answer is correct. And as I said before, this is sometimes a little tricky to do. But see if you can get it as close as you can. We've already said place the blank at the end of the sentence. If it's answered in numerical units, specify the unit required. So what does that mean? So for example, if I gave a student a question like, in a foot there are blank, and I didn't say inches, well, the student might think I'm asking for, um, centimeters, or it could be confusing. But if I said in how there in a foot there are blank inches, then the student knows to put 12 if I give the inches. Avoid giving clues to the correct answer. So this is sometimes a little tricky. Um, you can see your textbook for some of the examples of this. But even when I said an example of the person who draws as A or Ann, that's even a little clue, because Ann would come before a word that begins with a vowel, so it might cue them to say illustrator. It's really difficult to write even these simple items well, and you have to put a lot of thought into them. Short answer items, these are the items that require a sentence or a paragraph or two. The difference between this and completion items is that there's no blank to fill in. Students respond more naturally to a direct question. So, for example, if you say, please, please explain briefly how a rainbow forms. That doesn't prompt them to fill in a blank, but they have to write a few sentences about it. These, because they're a little more complicated, are better at assessing knowledge and comprehension. And sometimes, if they're cleverly worded, you may use them to assess higher level thinking. The problem with them is that they're a little bit longer, and scoring is more subjective. Because you're asking students to write more, you have to determine if it's right or wrong. As we just get into the discussion of rubrics, you'll see how you can use rubrics to score both short answer and essay items. So what are some examples of good short answer items? So you might say, which river serves as a border between Ohio and Kentucky? That could be answered in a couple of words, right? It could also be done as a completion item, just by rewording it. The river that serves as a border between Ohio and Kentucky is blank. What is the volume of a tetrahedron with edge length of 1? Provide your response to the nearest thousandth. So yes, math problems are a type of short answer items. They're considered constructed items. And list the 3 branches of the U.S. government. All of these can be done in a few words. So that's why they're good short answer items. What are the guidelines for developing effective short answer items? Well, you should state the item so that only one answer is correct. Again, you're going to get answers that you sort of feel like, well, maybe that's correct, and this is just part of the process. But as much as you can, be clear and ask students to word it in such a way that there's one obvious answer. Many times what I'll do for instructions is to put answer with the best answer. That kind of covers you if students are heading around but don't come up with the best answer that you're looking for. State the item so the required answer is brief, because if it's not short, it's not a short answer. Do not use questions verbatim from textbooks or other instructional materials. So students are likely to have seen those questions. And again, designate units required for an answer, especially in math. So let's talk for a bit about essay items. This is where students write a longer response on a more complex topic. As we said, they're good for assessing higher level thinking skills and deeper understanding of content, but the drawback is they can be difficult to score, they can be time consuming, and you may confuse writing ability with content area. What are some guidelines for developing effective essay items? First, construct the item to elicit the skills identified in the objective or the learning target. So if you are asking students to identify events leading up to World War II and state their significance, that should be your essay question. Don't have an essay question about what happened after World War II if your objective is not that. It should align with your learning target or objective. Write the item to clarify the specific test. So be very specific. What is it you want them to do? If you want them to list 3 facts or 5 opinions or whatever it is, be very specific about what you're looking for. Indicate approximately how much time students should spend on each essay item. So you might say 20 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is. You might say 1 to 2 pages, but you should give them some guidelines. Otherwise, what students will do is they will go and do that one first, that essay item, and have no time left for the rest of the test. And avoid giving students options as to which essay questions they will answer. Teachers like to do this. They like to give a choice of 1 or 2 or 3 essay items. And what happens in this case is that students will pick the easiest one, the one with which they're most familiar. You won't really get a sense of their knowledge on the other topics. And so let's say you're teaching 3 or 4 learning objectives, and a couple of them should be assessed with an essay item. If you give them a choice between the 2, you have no idea what they know about the other topic. So don't give options on essays. Let's talk for a bit about scoring essay. So when I construct an essay item, what I do is I sit down and I think about what is the ideal answer? What would be like the anchor paper? And sometimes what I do is save papers from year to year, strip the name off so that students coming up in the year behind won't know who that student is, but I show them a really good paper. That's called an anchor paper. So what constitute a good or acceptable answer? And I make a list of all the things I want to see. Maybe I want to see good coverage of content. Maybe I want to see good organization, or I want to see good spelling, punctuation, grammar, lots and lots of things. I make a list of that. And it can just be a bulleted list. And then I say, okay, I'm going to do one of 2 types of rubrics, a holistic rubric, which we'll get into in a minute, or an analytic rubric. And then I clarify the role of writing mechanics. And here's where we often trip up with rubrics. If we're going to score an essay with a rubric, and we're most concerned about understanding content. Now I'm going to put aside the case where it's a writing rubric. But let's say it's a rubric in science, or it's a rubric in math, or it's a rubric in social studies, or even a rubric in reading. Then I want the majority of my rows on the rubric to be about the content and the skills covered by the objective. So, for example, if I want to have students identify motivation from a character, that would be something you could do in an essay. I want to have most of my point values be about identifying motivation in a character. Maybe I care about students writing, but maybe I want to weight that a little bit less. So I want to see good punctuation, grammar, spelling, but I'm not going to make that the majority of the grade. So I always include a row in my rubrics about writing and mechanics, but I don't make that the majority of the grade. If possible, when you're grading, score 1 item at a time, and then keep the identity of the student anonymous. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll have students, I used to have students put numbers on the back of their paper instead of names, and I had a key that I didn't look at while I was grading about which student it was. And then I was grading anonymously. You know, as teachers, we're human beings, and so we have students we prefer and students that maybe give us a little harder time. And so that subjectivity comes into grading. And if you can eliminate that subjectivity as much as possible, especially when you're grading subjective things like essays, it's a good thing. So I said that there were 2 types of rubrics, holistic and analytic. So let's talk about holistic first. In a holistic rubric, the teacher makes an overall judgment about an answer, giving it a single score or grade. This is really appropriate for an extended essay. And as I mentioned, teachers will often establish anchor papers to help guide them. Now, you can not only establish a top level anchor paper, let's say your rubric has 5 different levels, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You could have an anchor paper for 5. This is a really outstanding paper, like 5 is the highest. Then you could have one for 4, and then you could have one for 3, and one for 2, and one for 1. You could keep those papers in a set of folders from year to year and pass them around, or you could even upload them online, perhaps to have students look at them. Well, what would it have to look like to get a 5, to get a 4, to get a 3, to get a 2, to get a 1? And there are examples of these types of holistic rubrics in the chapter. Analytic scoring, on the other hand, is a rubric where every row is broken out and given a point value. Again, examples are in the chapter. But let's see what some of these look like so you can see the differences. Let's say I gave this prompt to students. All of us make decisions daily. Most of these decisions are unimportant. What to wear, what to eat, where to go Friday night in terms of long-term effects. Sometimes, though, a decision presents a real dilemma because of its possible consequences. Entering the service before going to college, playing high school sports, or working after school, ending a relationship. In your essay, tell about a time when you or someone you know faced such a dilemma. Make sure you describe the dilemma and the consequences, or the way in which the decision was made with specific details. So this might be an essay prompt appropriate for a high school essay. And my guess is it would be for a writing class. If I were to score that essay with a holistic rubric, that rubric might look something like this. Now remember, this is a writing essay, so it's not focused on knowledge or skills apart from writing. So a level 4 might be deemed exceptional. Focus is clear, very clearly stated, paper is well organized, major ideas are set off by paragraphs, tone is consistent and appropriate, no mechanical errors, all references are clearly cited and formatted. I think we could agree that that would be an exceptional writing paper. And it might be given a score of 4, which would correspond to a description of exceptional. If you go to the good, you see that the point value is reduced 3. Here it's a little bit, you're stepping down a little bit in terms of quality. So the focus is clearly stated. The paper is mostly organized and may have some problems. Most major ideas are set off by paragraphs. The tone is mostly consistent and appropriate. A few mechanical errors may be present. 1 or 2 references may be missing or incorrectly formatted, and that would get a point value of 3. Developing might be a 2. Although the focus may wander, it is discernible. The paper may have organizational issues. Major ideas are not always separated by paragraphs. Tones sometimes may be inconsistent or inappropriate. Many mechanical errors, but they do not interfere with communication. And more than 2 references may be missing or incorrectly formatted. So this would get a point value of 2. And finally, down at the bottom, we have poor number 1, poor. Would only get a point value of 1. Focus wanders and is not discernible. Paper may have major organizational issues. Most major ideas may not be separated by paragraphs. The tone is mostly inconsistent or inappropriate. Many mechanical errors that interfere with communication. Majority of references either missing or incorrectly formatted. So the reason this is called a holistic rubric is the fact that you're looking at the whole paper and you're saying, okay, well, where does this fit? You're trying to categorize it. Is it more like a 1? Is it more like a 2, a 3, or a 4? So you might get some papers that very clearly fit into, let's say, a 3. It hits all of those criteria. But you might also get some papers who are kind of between a 2 and a 3. So what some teachers do is they'll actually highlight both the 2 and the 3 and say 2.5. Others will choose a category based on the majority of the criteria. So maybe the focus is clearly stated, but there's some problems with organization. And major ideas are not always separated by paragraphs, but it's pretty good on the mechanical errors or references. So then it would be your call as to whether to put it in a 2 or a 3. This is holistic scoring. Now let's take a look at the same kind of criteria, but now we've organized it into an analytic rubric. So this is analytic scoring. You'll notice that across the top of the columns, we have the points, 1, 2, 3, 4. And we have the descriptors. You should always put descriptors when you do a rubric. So 1 we saw was poor, 2 was developing, 3 was good, 4 was exceptional. And by the way, when we write rubrics, we generally go from least to greatest, left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now running down the first column are the criteria or elements you're scoring on. So focus was one, if you remember from the holistic rubric we just looked at. Organization was another, tone, mechanical errors, and references. These are the exact same criteria that were in the previous rubric, only now they're broken out individually by rows. And you'll see that every cell in this table has a description. So a student might get a 3 because they clearly stated the focus on focus, but they might only get a 2 developing because they have some organizational issues. They might be very good at mechanics, so they might get a 4 on exceptional on mechanical errors, have no mechanical errors, but they might be missing 1 or 2 references, and so they might get a 3. So you see how an analytic scored rubric gives you the ability to give much more specific feedback to students, because now you're saying your focus is good, but your organization needs work. Whereas with the holistic rubric, it was just one big giant grab bag of criteria. What I do when I score this way is I add up all the points. So let's say the student got a 4 on focus and a 3 on organization, that's 7, and a 4 on tone, that's 11, and a 4 on mechanics, that's 15, and a 3 on references, that's 18. So they got 18 out of 20 points. If they were to get exceptionals on everything, it would be 20 points, 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4. So they got an 18 out of 20 points. That would be a 90%. So analytic scoring is used when you want to give very specific feedback on areas to improve with the student. Holistic scoring is used when you want to just give some general guidelines and score more quickly. So let's look at these and see if you can guess whether the rubric is holistic or analytic. So this is a rubric for group work, it looks like. Is this holistic or analytic? So down the rows, we see the criteria. Each criterion is broken out separately on a row. And in each cell, there's a description for the level. And so this would be an analytic rubric. Is this rubric holistic or analytic? Well, because all of the criteria are presented in one cell, this is a holistic rubric. So you don't have the criterion broken out. Instead, they're all presented together with the different levels. Is this rubric holistic or analytic? Well, again, because the criteria are listed and broken out separately, and there are descriptions for each criterion for each level, this is an analytic rubric. So what you're going to look for is you're going to look to see on the left side, the first column, if those criteria are broken out separately and scored separately. If they are, it's an analytic rubric. Is this rubric holistic or analytic? Well, because you don't see the criteria broken out separately, instead you just see a general description for each level. This is a holistic rubric. So I want to leave you with a little bit of a caution. We've been looking at writing rubrics, but as I said earlier in my presentation, you want to make sure that you're assessing your learning objectives or targets. So that earlier writing rubric, the two, analytic and holistic, were probably aligned with a learning target about writing. But if you're assessing content knowledge in a subject area, if you're assessing student skills in an area such as pre-K or K, then you're going to have a different kind of weight. You're not going to be assessing writing per se or as much. So you might have 4 or 5 criteria about the skill or the content knowledge, and you might have one row, one criterion, as I said earlier, about the writing. So we're going to get into rubrics much more next week, where we're going to be starting our performance task and understanding rubrics better and how to design them. But this is just a little introduction to rubrics because we were talking about constructed items and how to grade them, how to grade essays. So everybody have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week.